Hello, everybody. Jeff Hoverson here with Gary Emineth's show. I'm honored to be a guest host today. I'm from District 3 in Minot, North Dakota. And in a little bit, I'm going to be introducing to you somebody you may already know about, Vicky Steiner, one of our awesome legislators in the House. But the overall theme I'm going to hit first today is a needed explanation. I think that I'm discovering that there's a lot of confusion when it comes to understanding bills in the legislature. And it gets especially confusing during an election when people get their mailbox full of bills, full of brochures that are talking about bills that legislators have voted on. And the needed clarification, the way I'm going to approach this is budget bills and policy bills. So if you had to categorize the whole bucket into two buckets, you could do it that way. The budget bills are usually handled by what we call an appropriations committee. So that's a big word, appropriations, but basically they deal with the budgets, the bills that are related to the finance. And then there are what we call policy bills. And that's pretty much everything else. I think the word policy is pretty self-explanatory there. But there's something that, especially during the election season, that it would do us all well to be aware of. And I've talked about this before, but I'm going to get into it a little bit deeper now. And actually, when I invite Vicky on, she might be able to weigh in a little bit too, because she's been at the game longer than me, and she's a lot smarter. I think you're going to see that right away. So anyway, budget bills, we get a lot of them every session. I'd say maybe even a third of our bills are probably budget bills, maybe, or a fourth. Out of 800 to 1,000 bills we deal with in a session, that's a lot of budget bills. That's a lot of funding bills that talk about everything related to money. And when a budget bill gets voted down, which, by the way, it seems to never happen in our legislature in the past few years, but when a legislator votes no on a budget bills don't die, okay? And that can be very misleading when we're reading advertising, slick advertising, when you get a brochure in your mailbox that says, oh, legislator such and such wants to defund whatever category that budget bill is. Let's say it's about colleges or, about the military or the arts or hospitals or whatever it might be, education. So you get a letter or a brochure in your box, and it says, Mr. or Miss Legislature wants to defund education because they voted no on some bill. You need to be aware that when a legislator votes no on a budget bill, it simply goes back to the committee. It goes back to usually the Appropriations Committee to be reworked. Maybe that legislator feels like it's too bloated, or oftentimes there's something in that budget bill that is a bit like, why is that there? Maybe there's a $20 million museum in the budget, and you're going, we don't think of that, or a $5 million amusement park, or something like that. And that happens plenty. A lot of stuff gets, no pun intended, gets stuffed in. And to say that they want to defund is misleading. And frankly, it's actually a lie, because they can't defund it by voting no. You can't defund with a budget bill. It simply gets reworked and then brought back to the floor for another vote. Policy bills, on the other hand, they do die. If there's a majority vote to kill a policy bill, it's over, whether that's the Senate or the House. So that clarification, I think you want to help your neighbor get educated on that, because across the state, there very likely will be, in the election, there will be one opponent or the other talking about votes that the current legislator has taken, and it can get a little bit confusing, but just being aware of that can be very helpful. So I'm going to bring in now Vicky Steiner, and Vicky's from the great Western North Dakota. Vicky, welcome to the show. What is the number of your district again?
District 37.
Oh yeah, the great 37. Is that right?
Dickinson.
Is that right in Dickinson or near or
Yes.
a little of both?
It's Dickinson, yeah, the heart of
Okay.
Dickinson, 4 square miles approximately.
Oh, look at there. Luke's got the map up. There we go. There's
Yep.
District 37. So I-94 goes right through. Awesome.
Yes,
So-
and we have 36 on one side and 39 on the other, and
okay.
so it's really the city of Dickinson.
Okay.
We don't have way south, and we don't have the far east.
Okay. I want to get into a little bit about your race and your campaign and a little who you are in a little bit, but just before I move away from budget and policy bills, did I do an okay job explaining the difference? And would you want to add anything to help people understand budget and policy?
Yeah, I took a couple notes. When you talk about budget bills, there's different kinds of budget bills. First off, only legislators can appropriate state funds. The governor cannot do it.
Yep.
And the emergency commission can do it if we give them statutory authority for emergency purposes only.
Okay.
But generally speaking, every 2 years, the budget bills, only legislators can appropriate state money. But
Okay.
you have agency budgets, like you talked about, like Health and Human Services or education. So for the DPI budget, education, if you didn't like something in this multi-million-dollar budget, you can say, no, I'm not voting for that. And then, of course, when you run again, your opponent can say, voted against education. But there could have been $1 million in there for something you didn't agree with, and you want to push it back to the Appropriations Committee, like you said, and have them take that out, fix it.
Right.
And if they don't get enough votes and they know there's a problem, that's what they do. So it is a way to pull stuff out of the agency budgets. So and when you talk about spending money, budget bills are not the only way we spend money. We spend money on special projects. So you can have a standalone bill for $250 million to build a new pipeline or something. And that would be a standalone budget bill, or they could tuck it into an agency bill. But like I said, for policy bills, you mentioned that once it dies, that's actually not completely accurate. If leadership or the governor really want that policy bill, you might see it come in an agency bill, which means they package it inside Health and Human Services and a multi-billion-dollar budget, and it just rides through. And they're not supposed to do that, but the Supreme Court tapped us on the fingers and said, stop doing that, because the OMB bill became a catch-all for all the things that didn't pass, and then they tried to run it a second time. And so the Supreme Court said, you need to stay on task with things that in a bill that makes sense for that particular agency. So we were told that wasn't such a good plan, but we've been doing it for many years, so we obviously thought it was a good plan. But anyway,
and it seemed like it was getting worse and worse all the time. And I remember, of course, 8 years ago, I was new, and I was shocked at that big OMB bill at the end. They just called it a garbage can bill. And I thought, oh, is that normal? And then you figure out later that not only is that not normal, but it's not right either. And I remember then a couple sessions ago being on Education Committee, and here we are at the end of the session, and all of a sudden what is brought into committee, but I think it was 14 other bills, many which have already been killed. And they're being stuffed back into another bill. And then by then I knew enough to know that this is not right. And a couple of us got pretty angry, and we went and checked with the Legislative Council, found where, in the Constitution it actually says you cannot do that. But unfortunately, in committee is a majority vote as well. So it was 8-6, 8-6, 8-6, all the way on all of those 14. They all made it back into the bill. And I remember, because I think that one had a really controversial bill in it. But anyway, thanks for that clarification. Yeah, didn't mean to cut you off, but.
Yeah, there's a number of ways to get things done, but one of the most successful ways to get things done, if you ever are trying to do something for Minot, Jeff, is to package it. And so you package it with Fargo, Grand Forks, Dickinson. You have a nice little package. We're all working together. Those are the bills that have the least controversial ride.
Yeah, Yeah, and they can be very hard to vote on because if you see something you don't like in it, but then there's also
Right.
your own hometown in it, it puts you in a tough
Right.
spot. Yeah, but good. We got about 30 seconds left here. Before we go to the other side, Vicky, I want to talk about, make sure I've got it straight on explaining to people the difference between now within our budget, general fund, SIF fund, and federal dollars. I want to get after that too. I want to bring up the whole idea of having a business leader as a politician, or you could even say business leader as a governor or whatever. But I want to talk about the pros and cons of that, because I think a lot of times conservatives naturally think we like getting business owners, we like business people to be in politics. And there are good reasons to want business leaders, I think. But I think we got to look at the cons that can happen too, because it gets into the role of government, in my opinion. But Vicky, why don't you go first? You said some pretty cool stuff in the break there about having a business leader in government. You want to expound on that?
Yeah, I think it's good to have some business leadership because they understand budgets and they know how they affect jobs. But you have to remember that when someone says to me, I think we should run the state as a business, I find myself thinking, you really do that because we have the ability to tax. And so
Right.
if you carelessly spent state money because you thought no matter what, this business is going to be afloat. Yes, it will, because you can always tax. So you have to remember that I look at it probably the opposite way, that government should be so lean
Yes.
that you have to increase taxation once in a while because you need the money. And
Yeah.
instead, what I see is people are always putting money in different accounts to wait for a rainy day, which is nice because that, as politicians, it makes us look very talented because we're always saving money, but it's the people's money. And
Right.
so if you save too much, then basically they are paying more taxes than they probably needed to pay. So you got to look at it. It's got to balance out. I do appreciate when we have business leaders who are managing the state's money, like they're looking at how much do we have in savings? We need to
Yeah.
put more of this and put it in investment. That has value, right? But also too, when we have surplus, I get in a little bit of trouble because I always try to get a little more back to the taxpayer, and it's not always popular. Out of 1.2 billion surplus last time, I think we did about maybe 400 million or so. And I was hoping to do 600 million, and I crossed a few people and they weren't too happy with me. But I feel like it's not my role to protect the state government as much as it is to protect the taxpayer so that we make sure that they've got some prosperity on the taxpayer end. So
Yeah.
I'm not as worried about the
Yeah.
state as other legislators might be.
Yeah. I think I'm pedaling I'm pedaling the same bike as you are on this. How's that for a phrase? I just came up with that one. It's kind of like swimming in the same river. But anyhow, I want to come at that too and highlight and say it in a different way. What I hear you saying is that there's a difference between how a business leader makes money and looks at making money than the government making money. It's two different processes. In business,
So in government, can I just say, government
Yeah.
doesn't make money.
Right.
Government
Okay. How they accumulate revenue, basically, how the government brings dollars into the government to do whatever, whether it's good stuff or special projects or bad stuff. But we attain money into the government simply by raising our hands for a vote. Okay, that's a crude way of putting it, but the bottom line is all in favor of taxing this much or whatever, or approving this budget bill, raise your hand. And if you have 50% or more, so it's pretty easy. It's not our money, it's the taxpayers' money, so it's very easy to raise your hand. And if you're a business owner, you're naturally inclined to want to grow. And so the downside, while there is, like you said really well, there's a downside, or excuse me, an upside to being a business leader, being a good money manager, making wise decisions. But the downside is that if you're wired like in business and you treat the government like it's your business, obviously you're going to want it to grow. So bringing in more revenue ends up being a good thing when it should be a bad thing.
Yes, and I think you've probably heard this language on the floor of we need to grow these programs, it'll generate more jobs. At the time we were doing that, we had jobs we couldn't fill. So if you actually owned the state as a business, you wouldn't have made that decision. But it's not your money, okay?
It's not.
And
right.
what I see is we have legislators who are very frugal with their own money. I doubt they would buy a Dairy Queen cone for somebody sometimes, but they're not, but they are willing to spend 150 million on a brand new project that might generate some jobs. Mike. So the one I'm sore about, the one project we did, because I was hopeful it was going to have some positives, and it was that 10 million for DGC. And then Mitsubishi, it was one of the special projects we did a couple sessions ago. And it just grates on me because we allocated $10 million because it was going to be a new process and possibly open up more economic development and all that kind of stuff. And Mitsubishi changed their mind and we wasted $1 million, I think, on that. And there was no transparency to the public on our little decision that we went into with very little information. That's the other thing. We, as legislators, have to recognize we're part-time in and out, and we're allocating big dollars to some of these projects. And so I'm probably a little more critical than other people, and some of the projects have worked out. So you can say, Vicky, look at this one, it really worked well.
But that doesn't matter, because the question is, first of all, you have to ask the question, is that the government's role? Now, in business, it would be their role, but should we even be involved in the project at all? Then if the answer is yes, now we need the good business leader's mind. But before that, you need a good political mind that asks, should the government even be doing this at all? And I think that question needs to be asked in order, because in a business, the way they make money is by convincing the public or convincing somebody to buy their product or service. The government, we don't have to do that. We don't have to convince a customer to buy it. We just have to convince a majority of each other to raise your hand in a vote. And that's a big difference. That's why we have to ask that question, what is our role as a government? And you're right, we're not ultimately a business. We obviously, even a church has business matters, but you wouldn't say a church is a business. And so I think, what's our role?
I would love to see the sponsoring legislator put his own money into it. We just say, I really believe that Mitsubishi's going to try this new project, and I'm willing to put 50,000 my own money into it. I just don't know how many of them would do it then.
Do you remember the story of David?
I don't have enough information while I'm voting to know, is this going to fail or succeed? I certainly want to help Beulah, North Dakota. It's a big project for them, but it didn't work out. But how many of those do we do? And so that's why I just don't feel like North Dakota is situated where we can, you pick that project, or you pick a project in Williston, or you pick a project in Grand Forks. These communities really appreciate that. But what role does the taxpayer have in risking that money?
Exactly. And even if it turned out to be a good investment, if it's not our role, we shouldn't be doing it. And I like the attitude that it should be as low as possible, unless the government either has to do this, but anytime the government, even if it is successful, they're still picking winners and losers. And,
always.
And so that's where it starts
I'm on finance and tax, and it's fair. Taxes should be fair, simple, broad. And
fair, simple, what?
Fair, simple, broad.
Oh, broad, yes, good. I like
fair,
that.
Simple, broad. That's But that's Senator Cook from Mandan, the late great Senator Dwight Cook would always say that in the Senate Taxation Committee, and I memorized it. And not all our tax breaks are broad. And even like the school lunch when I voted for it, that was not broad. So I do the best I can with trying to hang to those 3 words, but it's tough.
Yeah, it can be hard at times. We got a little time left, I think, related to this then. I'll put you on the spot here. What do you think about the government as a role, their role? Should the government's role be involved in the workforce development, or should that be left to the free market? We got about 40 seconds.
You can take a very conservative view on that issue. The problem is our citizens who are struggling with daycare really want something from us. So it's that expectation that government's role has morphed into more things than just safety, law enforcement.
Yeah.
You get demands from your constituents sometimes on they need help with making daycare more affordable or some way to get some action on that topic.
Yeah, we're about out of time. I'm really negative on the government subsidizing daycare. And we've been talking about just budget bills. We've been talking about, should the government be a business, or how does the whole concept of a business mind, a business owner, being a politician, where's the pros and cons? Now we're going to drill down into actually within a budget for our state, which the legislators deal with. I think we're at about a 20 plus billion with a B budget right now. But the total budget for the state is divided into categories. One of those, most people are probably already familiar with the term general fund. And then there are federal dollars, which is another part of our budget. And then there is what we call the SIF fund, which I can't remember the exact initials. That's why we got the one and the only, the wise one, Vicky Steiner, to help us with the SIIF SIF fund. Help me out here, Vicky. What does that stand for, and give us some history on that.
I think it's Strategic Infrastructure Investment Fund or something similar. But
it's a backup, isn't it? Kind of a backup fund. It's supposed to be a backup.
It used to be an overflow from the oil money, and it used to be in the olden days, really olden days, it was the Resources Oil Trust Fund. And the West would always say, hey, this is an oil trust fund. We've got some problems out West. So Bismarck and Fargo got together and said, we need to change that to a different name. So we're going to call it the SIF fund.
Okay.
But it's oil spillover money. It's when the oil revenues were coming in and budgets were met and allocations were there. And so then they would allocate the SIF. And then they started saying, we're going to put so much into the budget here, and then we're going to put so much into highway infrastructure here. And they started parsing it out. And so then you get to the very bottom of the SIF fund, and that's what we fight over if we have special projects in our district.
So is the SIF fund, was that originally intended to be spent every year, or was that intended to be, I thought I heard that the real purpose was that obviously you make an educated guess on how much revenue the state will take in and what your budget should be. But if you have a shortfall in the next 2 years, you can pull it out of the SIF fund to back that up. But maybe that was a narrow view.
You're right there. I think it was originally Resources Oil Trust Fund, as in trust fund, which is kind of a business language that you're not going to have the oil money back. You're not going to have oil is spent, the resources spent. And there you have that trust fund that can be used for emergency spending. But then the Resources Oil Trust Fund started to get used for projects. And when we were in our really lean years as a state, I think the Resources Oil Trust Fund really did serve a good purpose. But as we got into the Bakken, then when we had surplus, that's when they said, we can't just let everybody just spend whatever they want on this surplus. Let's itemize it out and have some go to highways and some. They started trying to make sure it was well spent. I don't have any argument with how they have used the SIF fund. It has been used for some of those more riskier projects because, as somebody would explain on the floor, we have a surplus. Here's a chance to risk something and see if we get a really big payoff. I'm not as comfortable probably as they are with that kind of language, but anyway, So you're going to get that where you have surplus and you have money that is not specifically allocated.
So it has a similar ring to what people might be familiar with now, the legacy fund. Help us understand the difference. What sounds a lot like the legacy fund. Is it the legacy fund's not a part of the budget, right? So
Well,
it's just a separate.
Yeah, no. And I think the founders of the legacy fund were wise that way. They thought we can't have $3 billion come in. And then the legislature says, wow, we could do some amazing things with it. This way it takes 30% right off the top, goes in the legacy fund for the future generations. And it takes a certain amount of vote to get it at the principal. And then we weren't able to use the interest off it for several years. And so it had to grow to a certain level. But anyway, we are using the interest of the legacy fund now for special projects and growing and adding into government programs and whatnot.
So did I do it okay?
And can I just say something about for our young people listening?
Please.
If you're in your 30s and 40s, okay, you are blessed for many things in North Dakota, but one of them is highways. We have put billions of dollars into highways and bridges that we would not have done. And you would have had to pay higher taxes in the future, but we have allocated legacy interest money for highways. And that actually, they'll never realize it, that they would have had higher taxes. They just won't have.
Interesting. That's a good thing to get that out there. I appreciate that because, the legacy fund, which you're referring to, and that was off the interest of we're talking, this legacy fund is growing by the billions with a B. And, there we go, legacy fund.
And the other, can I also say, Jeff, people think that if oil might go to 1 million barrels per day and that we're not in a good situation. That's not actually true with the legacy fund. The legacy fund was oil money, but it's been converted to Wall Street money. So it's investment money now. So oil can do whatever it's going to do, but we are invested in world markets there. We have good money managers and we get a really great rate of returns. What the 1 million barrels a day does not impact, it impacts how much the legacy fund will grow, how rapidly it grow in the future, but it does not impact our returns of investment or our interest rate.
Okay, that's a good clarification too. Now, if you go back to that slide that was showing, I thought it said, Luke had up there we go. Okay, $9.6 billion. Now, the legacy fund started in about, it was during the pandemic, during the oil boom. It was, 10 years old now? That's a lot of cashola in 10 years. When you're looking at a total budget, just a pure budget of the state being about 20 billion, what's in the legacy fund in 10 years being almost 10 billion, that's growing pretty fast. So at the rate of growth, wow, what would you see? Did I explain that right?
When Lynn Helms was the leader of the Industrial Commission's oil division, he had mentioned that by 2035, the Bakken play will be, as we know it back then in 2000, probably 2009, 2010 maybe, he had said that by 2035 we'll be a gas state. So that's why I did vote for the natural gas pipeline. Basically, we de-risked the project with some state money to get some private players in there. We don't want to have a state gas pipeline, which actually, if the public sector wouldn't have done it, I think I would have, really been looking at that strongly. But luckily, the private sector has stepped up, and hopefully we get that pipeline established, because as we become more and more with prolific gas production, it's going to be harder and harder with the oil side because of the flaring and no place to take the gas. Okay. And when you get up into the big numbers, Jeff, of gas and oil, sometimes the state does kind of step in and give it a nudge, which I know conservatives don't like, but it's...
Yeah, I'm learning right along with the people here because my committees have not been appropriations and budget stuff. So I just think this is really good for the public to begin to understand even just what funds we have and what feeds the budget. Do you?
Well, and I also say too, I want to
Yeah.
give credit to Representative Keith Kempenick, because Keith actually was worried about taking exactly the amount of interest generated each session, because you might have a really bad year and a really good year. So they did a 5-year rolling average, which I tell you, I shouldn't even mention any of it, because that's about all I know about it. Anyway, they don't take as much money as they could, because you have some down years and some good years in that 5-year window.
I see.
So you take an average because you don't want to overspend your fund.
Okay,
So it's a very conservative way to manage it.
yeah.
So I think, and that's one of those silent things that people don't see, and they think that we're reckless. Actually, we're not. We manage the state's money very well.
And in our last minute, we got a minute here left. Is it fair to say that the legacy fund does not come out of the traditional taxes? It's primarily tax on oil, or like you said, or investment. So I think people can feel pretty good about that billions of dollars, we're not storing up their tax money necessarily.
Oh, no.
So
that's oil money.
Yeah,
that's an oil tax. And
But
it's for the future, because the oil is gone out of the ground, and now it's in an investment on Wall Street and internationally. And so basically swapping one side for the other.
Yeah, I wish we had time to talk about whether we should have our own oil refinery, because I've heard that if we only sold it within North Dakota, we wouldn't have to follow most of the federal regulations. But I don't know if that's true or not, but that would be an interesting discussion.
I don't know anything
but she's has put in a lot of time and thinking into the issues of the regional jail, and just things related to that. Take it away, Vicky. What are you thinking?
I'm a member of government finance for the interim, and they have a subcommittee, as you mentioned, Jeff, the regional jail study. It's a subcommittee, and we had one meeting on it where the prison came and explained what they were doing. And the reason that it's come to our attention that, the prison is sometimes full, oftentimes full in the last few years, and they're bouncing people back to the county jails, which has helped county jails because they don't have empty beds. Every time you have an empty bed, it costs the taxpayer too, because the state will reimburse for these empty beds if they fill it with a prisoner. And I don't know if I wanted to educate people about, there are plans for regional facilities for these, what they call a regional jail. It isn't really a little tiny county jail in a little tiny town, but it's a big one. So like Grand Forks Correctional Center, 60 beds are in negotiations. Burley Morton did 120 beds. And then Northwest Reentry Center, 25 beds. Lake Region, 40 beds. Heart of America, 40 beds. McKinsey County Jail, 60 beds, 60 for men and 10 for women. And then the Southwest Multi-Correctional Center, 16 beds for women and 12 for men on work release. And then Ward County has 12 beds for men on work release. So this is what I learned last session, which was distressing to me, that the prison can also affect the sentence. The policeman find that somebody burglarized, right? And the judge says, I'm going to give you 3 years, and you already served 6 months in county jail waiting for your trial, and you settled and you agreed you were guilty. So I'm going to give you 6 months for time served, and I'm going to give you a year in jail. Okay. And if they might not serve very much of that time, and they said in committee, let's say they're supposed to go to a class, and the class is 6 months long, and they only have 5 months left on a sentence, then they go to a county jail because the county jail doesn't have that class because they can't get the class. They can't get the class for that time. They're bouncing people back to county jails, and they're not actually staying in prison. And the one that we just passed, it's going to be interesting to me see if we can get this one to stick. But sometimes the prison lets people out a little early because they're very good in prison. They're not assaulting people. They're very quiet. They're very good prisoner. And so they might get to go to a county jail if they just really behave themselves and they're near the end of their sentence. But I'm I just feel like these judges must be so frustrated, not even serving close to their their sentence. And so what I see is policemen saying, and I don't know if we locked up here, but if we see that they don't serve their sentence, then legislators go to what's called a minimum mandatory, meaning we're not going to let the prisons determine that they've been a good prisoner and they can get out a year early. We're just not. If you do certain crimes, you will serve time. We did pass that House Bill 1361. You might remember it, Jeff, that it was a mandatory minimum sentence for human trafficking. And so you traffic an adult, it's 10 years. And if you would traffic a minor, 20 years for Class AA felony.
Yeah.
That is really important to me, that if you do something really horrible, you got to serve your sentence. And I don't want the prison saying we're full, so we're going to reduce your sentence and you can go sit in county jail for a year or two. Because what we were finding with traffickers, as soon as they get out, they just take it up again. And we needed to really clamp down on that.
Yeah, I do remember that bill. And so how do you think the county jails feel about the situation right now? Do they, I suppose there's nothing that can really be done about it other than building new jails or bigger prisons.
I think it's an interesting dynamic. I was watching Body Language, and I don't think the county guys wanted to say anything publicly, but there must be a little bit of a rub. I don't know what it is exactly, but it could be too that the counties benefit from getting state money so much per bed, and then their beds are full. But the county could be getting somebody with more severe, he could be really well behaved in prison and only have 2 years left on a more serious sentence. And so they might I don't know. The counties didn't say anything publicly that was a problem. It was just that they're waiting for the prison. I think that we have passed some money for additional prison beds. And so we're going to try, and there's been an increase of how many prisoners we've had. And so we need to do something about it. We can't just dump people in county jails. That's not going to work.
Yeah, and I remember the chart. I think the Attorney General brought a chart, or it was part of the packet, and there was a sharp increase. And I know there was like a list of all the types of crimes. I think they had marked. We were circling like the high-level crimes that were really bad, like human trafficking, et cetera. And I can't remember when that sharp increase took place, when it started to go up. And just from a historical perspective, do you remember, Vicky, was that like since the oil boom?
Yeah, we've definitely had a spike, and the average court imposed sentence has gone down. Most new admissions have sentences less than 5 years. But the percentage with 5 years or more has increased by 20% over the last decade, from 12 to nearly 16%. They've tried to do this thing where, if we treat them well, they're going to rehabilitate and they won't commit the same crimes when they're released out into the public, because the prison is trying to get them ready for release, and try and help them get ready. But when the prison was full, they were trying to get them pushed out to the county jails. And so it came to the legislature's attention that the prison was full and we needed to either help the counties do regional jails, or we had to do something.
Are you familiar with it? This is related, but there was a news report I saw, and you just made me think of it now, so I can't remember. I think it was El Salvador. I'm not really sure, but there was a country where they started to, it's a new thing, but basically all the prisoners, and I don't think they did this with the high level crimes, but for a lot of the crimes, they worked them like 6 days a week, just rotating around from sewing uniforms for state things and building desks and furniture for things that the government might need. Anyway, they worked and worked. And it was very interesting. They were pretty well work ready, had a new work ethic. They reduced their entertainment time like way down to 1 1 hour a day of watching something on a screen, maybe. I'm guessing, I can't remember anything, but stuff like that, where I thought that was very interesting because you do wonder, is there a way to intercept a person's life while they're in prison? And basically, while you can, take away a lot of the privileges that we enjoy out here instead of kowtowing to those that want them to kind of have it made in the shade, so to speak.
And I think Rough Rider Industries does a good job, and they do give them skills. And we have a lot of work release programs. One of the big stumbling blocks or obstacles for prisoners, I think, is housing. So especially if they're a felon, it gets more difficult to get a job and get housing. And so you actually, if you don't help them with that end, they end up going back into the criminal world because they have no money. They have no way to survive.
Yeah, that's a worthwhile discussion to have because I think there's a really difficult balance between, one side that wants harsher and longer prison sentences, so build more prisons, and maybe the other side's more emphasizing on, is there some rehabilitation that can be done so that when they do get out, they are a more productive citizen. And obviously, I'm sure everybody would agree there are certain crimes that, sorry, you're in for life, you're separated from society. There's just no two ways about it. But I don't know, did you feel that tension when we were doing these bills? I sure did, between the kind of the two sides there.
Yeah, there are certain crimes too, like the human trafficking and of minors. I would probably throw away the key myself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're talking
But
more the moderate.
We do 20 years.
The moderate level here anyway. But okay. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. It was just getting good there, Vicky. But thank you so much for being on the show, sharing your wisdom with us. God bless you. We'll see you next time. And God bless North Dakota.